But we're going to start here with a tweet called "The Same Page." The same page. Call it identity politics, an ideology of division for the purpose of achieving power. Call it intersectionality, equality through systematic otherism. Call it social justice, a modern religion promising moral virtue. Call it cultural Marxism. Call it collectivism. And of course, this tweet here has a second tweet, a sister tweet, which is also named, which is called systematic otherism. So we're going to read that tweet too, and then we're going to break it down. Call it identity politics, an ideology of division for purposes of gaining power. Call it intersectionality, or intersectional feminism, equal outcomes via victim mentality. Call it social justice, a modern religion promising moral virtue. Call it cultural Marxism, or you can call it collectivism, or I also sometimes use the phrase social Marxism, which is sort of the same thing. This is all about a form of social engineering, and I don't mean the type that you experience when a hacker tries to get your password at work, or that kind of social engineering. Actually, a friend of mine, we have been talking about this term, linguistically, what's a better way of, framing this? And I think cultural engineering is a better way to go. So what am I talking about here? If you're familiar with the channel, you know that we do talk a lot about individual agency and sort of individualism versus the group mentality, the groupthink mentality, the hive mind. We talked about it in my last video, and we've talked about it in the past. But let's start from the top here and just talk a little bit about this. So, identity politics is an ideology of division for gaining power. You pit two or more sides against each other, and you try to create friction that leads to certain outcomes that you desire. You may want to persuade them, the people, in either of these groups or more. There is more than two. But for the purposes of this discussion, let's call it two. You pit them against each other, and you kind of incentivize them to see each other as the other, to see them as a foe, someone that could harm your chances at achieving opportunity or success. And then you say, well, you don't want to be in a situation where that person has power. And these people, may they be politically aligned a certain way, religiously aligned, it could be occupational, it could be about immutable characteristics, which is the real problem when you're focusing on immutable characteristics that can't be changed and not focusing on the character of somebody, their merits and their flaws. We really should be focusing on individuals, because you can't really judge anybody by the group or groups that they're a part of. That's part of my ideology and what I sort of preach on this channel, and I try to practice what I preach. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So intersectionality, some people call this fourth wave feminism. You have your first wave, your second wave, your third wave feminism, and your fourth wave. So, intersectionality is a ideology where you split people up into groups. You look at them by immutable characteristics like race, sex, and things like gender, your ethnic background, where you came from, the things you can't change, your skin tone, things like that. There's also mutable characteristics, things like occupation and religion and belief systems and other groups that you could find yourself associated with. But intersectionality purports to cast those in the majority or in a position of any kind of what they call privilege as the oppressor, and then you have the oppressed. So if you have a situation where one group has a bit of an advantage because of maybe numbers or maybe anything else, whatever it might be, the situation, geographically, geologically. There's so many different cases where people may have some kind of advantage if they live in the city versus the country. There's different advantages to both. And of course, with immutable characteristics, you can look at, male, female. You can look at people that are trans or gender fluid and just look at things that, make their lives easier or harder in different contexts. But again, it's all very contextual and largely subjective. And no two people are alike. We have 7 billion people on this earth, and we all have our own perspectives. We all have our own preferences. And largely, we all have something called in-group preference. So intersectionality seeks to achieve equality and equity, which are virtuous things. They are altruistic things. But it does this through systematic otherism, so creating others and saying, well, you're in this group, and this group. And how are those 3 groups oppressed by other groups? And it's not about focusing on individual situations, but just sort of looking at the group and going, well, X group oppresses Y group. And there's sort of a set belief on what those groups should be. And of course, different intersectionalists, as some people call them, will find that they have their own in-group preference for certain sex, S-E-C-T-S, of that group. We've seen the feminists, we've seen trans advocates, LGBTQ+, people from all different sides going at each other regarding their immutable characteristics. So there is friction between all different kinds of groups, and these ideologies seek to foster an awareness and perhaps even a persuasion to push against others. Thus, I call it altruistic otherism. You may call it altruistic sexism, altruistic racism. And when I talk about generating racism, well, this is a little bit of what we're going to be diving into. I also frame it as a modern religion. And when we talk about this, I mean social justice. Social justice is a modern religion, a system of real-world moralism in which people can achieve moral virtue and universal truth while redirecting their hatred, their irrational hatred as human beings, in the process. So disciples of the modern religion of social justice will say, you're in this group, immutable characteristic, your skin tone, and because of your skin tone, you are privileged, you are the oppressor, and you must be taken down a peg. But I ask the question. I ask the question often in my videos, asking questions of the disciples of the modern religion of social justice and censorship in other modern religions. I ask, when does the tide turn? When does the inertia meet its counterforce? Right? When do you pull back? When does the crusade end? And you realize the war is over and you move in the other direction. When does the oppressed become a form of oppressor? These are the kind of questions we need to ask when people are proselytizing to a modern religion. Like, what is the virtue of this? How does this benefit the greater good, the people? And how does this benefit me? And am I being oppressed? Or is there a point where it's no longer really virtuous, but it's just becoming mean, or there's another form of situation going on? So it promises moral virtue. People that are moralists, and they may not be non-secular, they may not have a religion like Christianity or Islam. They may be devoutly secular, and yet they find this moral code, this system, in which they can achieve moral virtue. They can virtue signal, and they can try to enact a form of real-world moralism. And that gives them dopamine, that gives them a feeling of meaning, purpose, order, and worth. And that's, there are benefits to it. I'm agnostic on the modern religion that is social justice. And of course, when we talk about social justice, people say, well, how can you oppose social justice? And I say, well, again, just as we were talking about cultural engineering and social engineering, this term social justice means different things to different people. In some way, you can look at social justice as simply achieving a form of, equity, that people are treated equally. All men are created equal, all women and all people, humankind, peoplekind, are created equal. We should be treated by how we interact with the world, what our merits and flaws are, what our character is. Our individual agency should not be undermined. That is my philosophy on that. And yet, that's social justice. That's giving people the positive liberty they need to succeed. But then you have social justice, which is, when you talk about social justice warriors, you're talking about a specific collectivist, group-minded ideology. It's a very specific thing we're talking about. I usually capitalize it and call it a modern religion, frame it that way so that people can understand the difference between lowercase social justice and uppercase the modern religion. So some people refer to this as cultural Marxism or social Marxism. And again, a Marxist scholar may disagree with how I'm characterizing Marxism. Definitely seek subject matter experts and leave me a comment below with your thoughts and observations on how the use of the word Marxism is involved with cultural Marxism. But essentially it's the same sort of placing people into groups. Marx, in some of his teachings, would place people into class groups and say, well, the rich, the bourgeois, versus the poor. I believe they call them the proletariat, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. And he separated people into groups and looked at them that way. And on this channel, we preach individuality. So, and naturally, I like to look at people for their own contribution. What they bring to the table, good, bad, neutral, and in between. And of course, there's the collective, and then there's the individual. So you have collectivism and individualism. And of course, thinking in absolutes is a fool's errand, so you don't want to get too bogged down in labels. Of course, you don't want to cast somebody a certain way and say it's absolute. These postmodern ideologies, it's not great when they mix with an absolute world, because they sort of purport that everything is a construct and we can sort of design reality as we see fit. And of course, if you go too far down that road, you let the inertia take you all the way, well, you reach a place called clown world. So collectivism, there are some benefits and there are some costs to thinking with a group-minded ideology, a view of the world, a perspective. And there are many benefits to having self-esteem, individual agency, and viewing yourself as an entity that can make choices and doesn't have to be guided by the associations. Or, you also have guilt by association, guilt by conversation. You're in this group, so you must or must not do this thing. I try to dissuade people from that notion. So systematic otherism, and again, it's all for good intentions, and like I say, good intentions pave the road to somewhere. I have a video, Intersectionality and the Road to Hell, so maybe it paves it to the road to hell, the yellow brick road all the way down.